What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Warhammer 40k Boltgun, a boomer shooter that released last year that I wanted to check out but quite frankly didn't have the time, which might have worked out for the best because it very recently released a DLC which seemed like the perfect opportunity to jump in. But to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked in the description as well. Now, in the case of Boltgun, it is important to mention that while I did not receive what you would call a review copy technically, I did receive a promo copy of it. Just ahead of this year's Warhammer Skulls event, they sent me several codes for several different Warhammer 40k games because their event celebrates all of their video games, and that code also included the recently released DLC. So I did in fact receive a copy of this from Games Workshop. But with that out of the way, let's talk about what this game is, what it's all about, etc. Now, gameplay-wise, luckily, very easy to wrap your head around, as boomer shooters, at least in terms of gameplay, are pretty much exactly what the name would imply and what you've seen on screen up to this point, which is basically kill everything that moves. With, of course, the more nuanced stuff being how each weapon handles, reacts, and affects individual enemies, what combination of enemies they're throwing at you, and how you pick apart that sort of combat puzzle, though obviously with a very heavy emphasis on action. And while I didn't know it at the time, I did think it was actually interesting that the story of this game connects to the first Space Marine game, which is getting a sequel just here in a couple months, and I just didn't realize these were directly connected. But we'll talk about that in a moment, because first I want to talk about the technical state of this game. How's this thing running? Well, in that regard, it's pretty good. Honestly, I didn't really have much of any issues, outside of the enemy sprites occasionally getting stuck on things here and there. However, with this game having been out for a while and its recent DLC release, I can look to things like Steam reviews to get an idea of how it's playing for everyone else, and the main thing I noticed there was people referring to FPS drops when the game is displaying a ton of enemies. Now, I personally didn't experience this, but apparently for some people in arenas that are particularly dense with enemies, which usually comes on higher difficulties, sometimes that will cause a certain amount of stutter or frame rate dips. So your mileage may vary a little bit in that regard. But with that said, let's move on to difficulty. Now, there's a few things I want to talk about here in addition to just the actual difficulty that are kind of related. But in general, there are 4 different difficulties for this game, easy through very hard, more or less. Now, what I liked about this is what these difficulties actually affect, because enemies are largely unchanged by whatever difficulty you have the game on. They're going to have pretty much the same health, weapons affect them the same way, but what does change is how much damage they deal to you, as well as their exact composition. That is to say, the number and type of enemies you're facing in a certain combat scenario will change. Now, I like this because it teaches you still how each individual enemy is going to react on every difficulty to the things you're doing, which means even if you're playing on low difficulty, which means you're taking minimal damage, you're still learning effectively how the enemies work, which is a good starting point for moving up in difficulty and messing around with those higher tiers if you actually want to. However, where I do think that falls apart a little bit is the fact that the enemy AI is not great. Now, personally, I was just playing this game because I review a lot of RPGs, and this time around I just wanted to play something where I could shoot some stuff. But on higher difficulties, enemies can hit like a truck, so how do you deal with that? Well, you got basically 2 ways if you're not incredibly talented at shooters, which I certainly don't claim to be, but I did beat this game on the highest difficulty, utilizing these 2 things. The first one, and by far the easiest, is the fact that enemies seem to be sort of leashed to a general area, so if you move out of that area, they're only going to pursue you so far. So a lot of times you can just sort of back up out of their range and snipe them from afar, as there doesn't seem to be much of a range limit on a lot of your different weapons. Now, there are some arenas where you can't really do that, but there are plenty of times where you absolutely can, and it will definitely break the encounter a bit. Now, for those times where you can't do that, what I recommend is simply what I like to call wiggling. Basically, if you move back and forth side to side as you're moving forward or wherever it is you happen to be running to, the enemy seems to have a hard time keeping up with where it should be aiming and firing at, allowing you to much more easily dodge most attacks with minimal effort. And while that's not a foolproof method, you're still going to have to engage with the game a fair bit. It does work very well. And because of how those things work, I can honestly say that while I can appreciate the higher difficulties for people who are like really good at this type of thing, speaking for myself, I enjoyed the game most when I was playing on a lower difficulty and could just kind of mindlessly go to town. But you've got a good subset of options either way, I think. But let's move on a little bit and talk about the story now. So the story setup of this one is more engaging than you might initially think, but I doubt it's going to win any awards. So essentially, in the wake of the original Space Marine game, the Forge world of Graia, I believe it is, has been under heavy watch by the Inquisition. However, in spite of this, it seems that some rogue tech priests of the Forge world have been experimenting with the power source from Space Marine, which has caused a warp rift to open on the planet again, thus invading it with various forces of chaos that we need to put down with our protagonist, Malum Cato, a space marine of the Ultramarines chapter, who while initially sent in with a team becomes the only survivor of their initial landing. And then throughout the rest of the game's chapters, it unveils a little more about your enemy and some general plot events. So while I wouldn't say the story is amazing, there's more to it than you might initially realize. And because this connects so much to the original Space Marine, I'm actually very curious how the events of Space Marine 2 will tackle this, if at all, which admittedly they may have actually stated somewhere already. I'm intentionally trying to avoid that stuff, so please don't spoil it for me if you happen to know that already. But from there, let's talk a little bit about what I'm just going to call progression. So normally this is where I would talk about progression systems, and we're going to do a little bit of that with the weapons that you're going to pick up. But I also want to talk a little bit about how the game is set up. So the story takes place over 3 chapters. Each chapter consists of a handful of missions, and the base game at least, those chapters range from, I would say, anywhere to like 5 to 20 minutes. So relatively short levels. However, in between these chapters, you actually don't keep up your acquired weapons. So at chapters 1, 2, and 3, the very start of each one, you'll start out with basically no weapons or your base bolt gun. Again, sort of resetting your accumulated progression up to that point, which I thought was strange, but only in terms of weapon unlocks. Now, in the later chapters, they give those weapons back to you very quickly. So it's not a huge deal, I just thought it was an odd choice. But otherwise, your main form of progression is your weapons, what you'll be able to pick up on an individual level, and how you can then use that weapon in combination with some power-ups to alter it potentially for the rest of the level, or temporarily through buffs. Now, individual weapons are of course better against certain types of enemy, but the part I want to talk about in this section, before we move on to gameplay, is simply the power-ups. So as you move through a level, you can find all sorts of secrets, which are generally power-ups. A lot of these are temporary, such as buffing up your bolt gun with a special type of ammunition for a little while, increasing your armor, massively increasing your overall damage for like 30 seconds, that kind of thing. Some of them, however, are a little more permanent, such as your machine spirit pickups, these little emblems of the Adeptus Mechanicus. These will upgrade whatever weapon you are actively using when you pick up that power-up, thus making your weapon a little bit stronger than it normally is. So that's important to remember to make sure you're buffing up the weapon you actually want to use in that particular mission. Otherwise, though, pretty simple progression as you would imagine. So from there, let's talk about gameplay and some of the individual elements. So structurally, I already mentioned that the game is divided up into chapters and missions, but after you complete each mission, you can actually chapter select them from the main menu, so you can jump to any point in the game afterwards, which is useful for knocking out anything you may have missed, or simply replaying cool sections. But obviously, we're going to be doing a lot of shooting. So, in addition to our weapons, we do actually have a few other things our character can do, such as a charge, which is obviously useful for covering distance, but if you jump at the end of it, you can also carry that momentum forward very, very far, which is useful for navigating around and quickly moving from one space to the next. And speaking of that movement, as we are in a full suit of power armor, if you happen to land on some enemy's sprites, it will destroy them, which I thought was really funny. And one of the ways this game really captures the feeling, or at least the fantasy, of being this jacked up space marine tearing through enemies. We also have the ability to pick up and throw various types of grenades, some of which blow up after a delay, some of which blow up on impact. There's a power-up called a vortex grenade that kind of sucks everything into its radius and then deals damage over time, in addition to just your regular weapons. Otherwise, we're going to be moving through the game's various levels, tackling enemies. Now, level-wise, I think is where the game could stand to be improved, and mostly does so in the DLC with a few exceptions, but the issue with the levels, especially at launch when there was no navigation present, is that the levels were either just straightforward walks through linear hallways essentially that offered pretty much nothing because it was just a shooting corridor more or less. Or the other side of that, these kind of maze-like levels that were easy to get lost in moment to moment, including one with a portal maze. So while there are a handful of cool vistas, some of the levels can honestly feel just a little bit uninspired in terms of their design. And while not really a deal breaker for me, I do think it is of note. Worth a mention though that these days there's a navigation mode which will actually point you to your current objective, and mostly this is pretty good, but truth be told I think it could use some work because sometimes it seems to get a little confused or just is straight up wrong about where you need to go, especially if any sort of jumping is involved. But I can appreciate that they have at least tried to address some of the things I just mentioned. But let's talk about enemies. So, something that took me an embarrassing amount of time to actually notice is that enemies, when you have them targeted, have a number next to their health bar. That is their resistance. Your weapon has a weapon strength associated with it for each weapon you can pick up. Which obviously means if your weapon strength is below an enemy's damage resistance, you're not going to deal a lot of damage. And while it's not the only thing you want to consider when attacking enemies, as some of them do respond to certain specific weapons more than others, it's a very general way to get an idea of how effective the weapon you're about to use is going to be against a given enemy. Weapon-wise, however, we are basically looking at the Warhammer 40k variants of the typical weapons you might expect. You've got your standard bolt gun, your sort of great all-arounder, and with some power-ups it can actually be really strong against most things. You've got your standard shotgun, fantastic for one-tapping little enemies, especially the ones that run up close to you. Your plasma gun, I enjoyed the plasma gun, but it kind of functions more like a grenade launcher than you might expect because hitting enemies in close proximity with it will also damage you, but it is fantastic against the enemies that shoot flames at you. And then there was my personal favorite, the heavy bolter. This is kind of your standard minigun. No reloading, it just uses the ammo that you have available, and when powered up, I loved this thing. That gun has such a sort of meaty feel to it that I just loved shooting things with it. After that, you've got your Vengeance gun, a sort of delayed rocket launcher. You'll hit things with it, and then a short time later, that projectile will explode, dealing a bunch of damage to it and the enemies around it. Then you've got a Volkite weapon, which shoots a sort of thermal ray that will cause enemies to explode if it kills them, dealing damage to surrounding enemies. You've got a Melt-A-Gun, which can shoot through obstacles, which means you don't have to be super accurate with it. That deals a ton of damage, but eats up a ton of ammo as well. But then there's the Grav gun, probably my favorite to use overall, but obviously ammo for it is a bit sparse. You get this one towards the very end of the base story, and it destroys pretty much everything in a very wide area and deals a ton of damage, which I imagine was meant to feel like the BFG. Now, the fun of a lot of the moment-to-moment combat here is really just kind of learning what works best against what enemy, like I mentioned, and then putting that into practice against all sorts of combat scenarios where they're throwing different groups and types of enemies at you, and effectively juggling that plus your ammo while also moving around. And I think that is obviously where a game like this shines, and it's done very well in Boltgun. It was a ton of fun to do, and it was exactly the experience I was looking for when I decided to play this, as a sort of nice change of pace for myself that still required a certain degree of mastery. So between that and what you can see on screen, I just realistically don't think there's too much else to say about combat, other than the fact that occasionally, usually a couple times per level, the game will do what it calls a purge protocol, which effectively means you're about to be in a big combat arena where you need to kill all of the enemies in order to clear the purge status, and you're not going to be able to leave until you do, which means you need to be careful with things like ammo and pickups for the time being. Especially when you have a level that is sort of built around these encounters with specific weapons or power-ups in mind. For instance, the first time you pick up the heavy bolter, probably my favorite example of this, a short time after the purge begins, right when you pick up that weapon, you get access to a room just behind you that has an infinite ammo pickup that allows you to just go ham. Now, the last two sort of miscellaneous things I want to mention in this section are your melee weapon and the taunts. You do have a melee weapon, a chainsword to be specific, that allows you to sort of engage with enemies and whittle their health down as you tear them to pieces, quite literally. And while in general, especially on higher difficulties, you might not want to be getting close enough to enemies to have to use this, it still feels really great to use. And in the first mission, you actually have to use it for a little while. But then there's the taunts. So I just kind of wanted to mention this generally because it is very funny, but If you press T in combat, at least on a keyboard, I don't know what it is otherwise, you can have your character say something, usually shouting at your enemy some manner of Warhammer 40k death to the heretic style of insult. And over the course of my time with this game, I never heard any repeats of these, so I actually looked it up, and there's apparently like over 100 different insults that they recorded for Malum here to yell, which was just really funny, and I wanted to mention it. So I mentioned this game very recently got a DLC, and that is the Forges of Corruption one. This adds essentially a brand new chapter to the game where we get to investigate and take on enemies in a manufactorum, and this is going to include new enemies, a couple new weapons, and of course new environments. Now, enemy-wise, I would say they don't like fundamentally change up the game or anything, but after all of the enemies in the base campaign, it was nice to see some new ones, but then there are the new weapons. So you get a multi-melta or a missile launcher. The multi-melta is obviously just like the regular melta, but it shoots more projectiles per shot, and it's kind of like the heavy version of the base one, like the heavy bolter. Very cool weapon, enjoyed using it. But then we have the missile launcher, which right away, gotta tell you, this would technically be a rocket launcher. They don't have any sort of homing or targeting system. Now, I realize with the technology in-game that theoretically what I'm firing might actually be a missile, that is to say it has internal guidance systems, but the gameplay is not that. It actually just shows a rocket, which is a weird pet peeve of mine and not really important at all. Otherwise, though, the DLC does a few things differently from the base game. For starters, the missions themselves are longer. I found that most of them tend to run about 20 to 30 minutes versus the shorter individual missions from the base game. And another thing that changed is that in the DLC, I found myself running out of ammo a lot because a lot of the purge protocols for this one were just an immense amount of enemies that required you to just unload everything, basically, if I didn't just outright cheese it in some way. So a few of my early attempts here, I would lose fights just because I was running out of ammo to use, which took a little bit of, I would say, practice to sort of use exactly what I needed, whereas I just never really found that to be necessary because it was so abundant in the base game. So something to know. Now, technically speaking, this next part is not part of the DLC. It was added for free via a patch alongside the DLC, which is Horde mode. Basically, once you're done with the actual game, if you want to keep on killing things, you can fire up Horde mode and take on wave after wave of the enemy across any difficulty you would like, and just sort of enjoy the basic gameplay. This is pretty much exactly what you would expect it to be, so not much to say there. Now let's talk Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is a great way to play this game, provided you don't mind using a controller. Now personally, this is not the kind of game I can play with a controller, so it's not for me, but otherwise it is verified on Steam Deck, has controller support, etc. All the usual things you would want, so you're very good to go there. So if you wanted to play this game on the go that way, you definitely could, but it's definitely not a way to play the game for myself. Which brings us to the positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, this game feels great to play. It's fun to obliterate your enemies. It really feels like you're this hulking monstrosity of a man in a giant thing of power armor tearing his way through enemies, and I think they nail the fantasy of that really, really well. And for someone who fired this game up with the express intention of just kind of blowing things to bits for fun for a little while, the game is perfect for exactly that. Now on the negative side of things, I would say enemy AI and a bit of the level design here and there. Now AI, as I mentioned, it's kind of just broken sometimes. And while I certainly did a fair bit of that intentionally, sometimes it can do it when you're not intending it to happen at all. And then there are the game's levels. So I don't necessarily think these are terrible by any means. I just think they're a little bit uninspired with everything that you could have done with like the warp and chaos and whatnot. And most of the time it kind of just felt like I was running through a lot of corridors rather than interesting locations. But given the game that this is, I don't think that's a huge issue. And I will say I think the DLC actually did that part better, but really more of a nitpick than anything else. Which brings me to my conclusion. So the base game of Boltgun is $22 US and whatever that is regionally for people, and then the DLC itself is $6. And for me, I would say that seems about right. That is about the exact amount of money I would have wanted to pay for this experience, and it gave me a really fun roughly 20 hours or so. Which means recommending it is pretty easy to do. Basically, if you like this type of game, you enjoy a good boomer shooter, or you, just like myself, wanted to play a nice simple game where you could shoot some stuff for a little bit, then I think this one might absolutely fit the bill. Which is where we're going to wrap up this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.